Much needed COVID relief is expected to be on the way to Americans soon, nearly 1 year after the coronavirus was declared a pandemic. House lawmakers are set to hold a procedural vote on the American Rescue Plan today. A final vote will then be held tomorrow morning. It is expected to pass before heading to President Biden's desk for signature. The $1.9 trillion bill includes $1,400 stimulus checks, $300 unemployment benefits, a child tax credit increase, as well as money for vaccine distribution and other areas. For more on all this, I want to bring in Maya MacGuineas. She is the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, welcome. Great to have you with us. So you put out a statement saying this bill includes hundreds of billions of dollars for cities and states that don't need the money, as well as households making six figures that haven't experienced any income loss. What would you like to have seen done instead?
Right. And so the first thing to point out is it is very good that we passed a bill. There were some very important things that needed funding, most importantly, the fact that unemployment, part of the benefits, were going to run out soon. And that's one of the most important things we can be doing throughout this pandemic, alleviating the hardship for unemployed as well as fighting the virus. That said, this bill was not well targeted. And frankly, that's very well understood. And there were a lot of places we could have scaled back. There is absolutely no reason that a family making six figures that did better during the COVID period than the year before should be getting a check from the government. Is it popular? Of course it is, but it's not something that was well targeted. And likewise, while a couple months ago we were saying, let's get more money to the states, let's get more money quickly, they've actually done really well. And so in the end, it turns out that the bill is probably giving about 3 times as much money as necessary to state and local governments. Many of them are already planning tax cuts. So when your debt's as large as ours is, we really need to think carefully about how to get those dollars to the people and places that most need them. I'm glad we passed the bill. We could have done a lot better on targeting.
But how do you make the distinction between those families who do make six figures and are still struggling to get by? And, because of course this is based on prior years' income, right? So how do you make the distinction? Because you're right, there may be some families who make six figures who are doing just fine, but there are others in certain areas of the country who are certainly struggling. So how would you make that distinction?
You bet. I mean, I completely agree with that. And the real point of this was, how do we help people who are struggling related to COVID? There's a bigger picture in all of this, which is income inequality, wages, big things we're going to have to deal with structurally outside of an emergency COVID bill. But on this, I think the principle should have been, you need to be doing worse during the pandemic than you were before. No business, no family, no individual whose income actually went up during the period should have gotten additional resources. And targeting is not the easiest thing to do with the federal government, but we're able to do that. We're able to figure out how you could claw back money if people had ended up doing better on when their taxes came in. There are a lot of ways you could have structured it. It wasn't about not being able to draw a principled distinction. It was about a political promise where people want to make sure those checks were handed out as they had been promised to be. Frankly, there was a lot better use for that money in terms of people who are really going through hardships still related to the pandemic, both families and businesses.
And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget also estimates the bill could set the stage for $4 trillion of debt. What do you make of this? And, do you believe that this will ultimately be money well spent for the economy and American families, or do you believe ultimately it will do more harm to the economy than good?
So the first thing we know about the way that bills work is people always load on things that don't belong in them because it's so hard to get anything done in Washington. People feel like there's a vehicle that's moving, I've got to put a policy priority on it. There were a lot of priorities that don't belong in a pandemic emergency bill that were put in this. And importantly, many of them are for 1 year. The child tax credit, for instance, some expansions to Obamacare. They may be excellent policies, but first, they don't belong in a COVID bill. And second, they're only for 1 year, but the full intention is to expand them and make them permanent. That suddenly brings the price tag of this bill from $1.9 trillion to $4 trillion. And so again, we come at from the perspective that those might be excellent policies and have very important objectives that we should be pursuing, but you should be doing them on their own track, and most importantly, figuring out how to pay for them. I would just point out that giving a bunch of children a child tax credit while also handing them the bill from the increase in the debt isn't exactly the kind of policy that we really want to be focusing on kids. Overall, for the economy, I think this will do more good than more harm. I think this was the right thing to do. It was too big. It was poorly targeted, but we still need to do more. We are not out of the woods yet. And I agree with the Obama administration, the Biden administration, when people say it's better to go too big than too small. I think that's where you want to focus in terms of being cautious. But there was a lot more we could have done to make this really fit the moment, really get those resources in the right place, and still be cautious about the fact that we have a massive, about to be highest level of debt we've ever had in this country. And we've got to put some consideration on that issue as well.
And of course, this was meant to be sort of a pandemic relief bill. And in terms of the coronavirus, we do continue to see positive news, more vaccinations, lower infection rates. When do you think that we will see economic recovery from the pandemic?
Well, fingers crossed. It's great to see the good news that is happening. And it's in some ways, it's kind of a rush between the vaccine versus the other strains of the virus. But everything feels very positive, both on the healthcare front and the economic front. And my strong hope, and I think is the scenario I think is most likely, is that by summer and the warmer weather, when the vaccine has really become pretty widespread, things are going to open up. And I think the economy is going to come back very strongly. And again, that's not to say it isn't good to put these extra measures that we have been in, and there may be other things that are necessary if the economy weakens. But I am optimistic that there are enough savings, there's enough pent-up demand, there's enough people who are ready to go out and spend some of the money that they've either saved or that they received through the various stimulus measures, that I think we'll see a strong demand-driven recovery. There are concerns about inflation because this bill is just so big. I'm not overly concerned about inflation, but I think it's a possibility, and that would be a problem. I think the biggest weakness of this bill is not that it's going to overheat the economy in the long run, but that it squanders $1 trillion in resources, basically, that we should be more careful with, given that at some point we're going to have to deal with the debt. Every dollar that we borrow now is a dollar of debt that we're going to have, and that's going to add a lot more difficult choices down the road. We don't always want to be pushing these hard choices into the future. Right now is the time to borrow, but it's also the time to start thinking about how we're going to get that debt under control.
Maya MacGuineas, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.